Good morning. I'd like to start first of all with explaining my rationale. I've decided to focus on the voiced and the unvoiced dental fricative th and the sound in English. For example, thing and the. This is with a small class of general English students, and the average proficiency of the learners is A1, A2. They're young learners, aged 12 to 13, and they're all native Mandarin speakers living in Taipei in Taiwan. The th and the sound is very common in English, but it doesn't exist in Chinese, and so these learners really struggle to pronounce this sound. They generally replace the sound with a th or the d. For example, instead of thanks, they say thanks, and instead of the, they say d. Because these sounds are so common in English, their mispronunciation can give a negative first impression to the listener, and also gives a misconception that the learners are actually at a much weaker level than they really are. For their level, A1, A2, these learners actually have a fairly wide lexis, but because they struggle to pronounce words correctly, they're often misunderstood. For example, it can affect the communicative competence of the learners in pronouncing both individual words and connected speech. For example, I thought on Thursday becomes I fought on Thursday. And this can actually be very demotivating for these learners because they find it frustrating when they're not understood. And so it also impacts on their motivation. Moving on to procedure, I would first help the students to discover the sound by visually miming the sound to them. I would elicit from them where my tongue is, between the teeth, and what I'm doing, blowing air between the teeth. I would then ask students to identify the difference between the voiced and the unvoiced sound by listening to me. Next, I would ask them to use a mirror or a smartphone to put it in front of their face and to look at how they are pronouncing the sound. At this point, we would just work on the isolated sound rather than on the complete word. I would then use a kinesthetic approach by asking the students to put their finger against their lips and try to touch their finger with their tongue as they're pronouncing the sound. And as they breathe out, then I would ask them to voice the sound. So the initial voiceless becomes a voice as they breathe out. So we start with. I would ask them to put their hand against their voice box to feel the difference between the voices and the voice. Once they are able to hear and pronounce the word correctly in isolation, we would then work on choral and then individual drilling and chaining with the sound. So giving them a range of different words, this, thank you, they, the, and getting them to first listen to see whether they are voiced or unvoiced, and then practice using their voice box, feeling their voice box as an indication as to whether they're pronouncing the word correctly, and making sure their tongue is between their teeth and we can see their tongue by putting their finger in front of their mouth. I might also use some chaining with whole sentences to give students practice of connected speech with sentences like, today is her 3rd birthday, this food is healthy, and we might do front chaining as well as back chaining, healthy is food this. Again, asking students to feel their voice box to see whether the sound should be voiced or unvoiced, and making sure their tongue goes between their teeth and they can see it. They might use their smartphones for this so they can see at the same time. And for students who are really struggling with the sound, I might use a mirror and stand next to them and pronounce the words with them so they can see the difference in my mouth shape and theirs and where my tongue is and whether or not the sound is voiced or unvoiced. In order to practice the sound further, I would probably use 2 very simple activities. First of all, tongue twisters. This class likes a challenge, and so although some of these words they might not be familiar with, they'll enjoy the fact that it's a long sentence, and they'll enjoy a competitive element to try and see who can pronounce the tongue twister the best. So I might choose something difficult like, they thankfully think this thing is the best thing that they can throw the 3 times they need to throw a thing, and ask them to compete with me to see who can say it the fastest. Although I think that probably their pronunciation of these words won't be very clear, and actually they don't even know the meaning of all of the words, I will use this as a way to get them to practice the th and the sound with a competitive element because they'll enjoy this. I might then use a simpler one to focus again on their pronunciation, such as the example given in Kelly's book from his French students, where he says this theatre, that theatre, this theatre, that theatre, this theatre, that theatre, and get students to compete in teams perhaps to see which team can say it most clearly. I would then ask them to make up their own tongue twister. This is a very creative class. They're in 3 teams and they really enjoy trying to come up with the best, most creative work, so I think they'll enjoy this challenge. As a final activity, I might use Pronunciation Journey from Mark Hancock's book, and on the left-hand side have voiced the words, and on the right-hand side have unvoiced the words, and ask students to navigate their way through the journey by saying words from either column, left or right, and then moving between the 4 different steps in the journey. I would probably model this first as a listening exercise and then go into practice in pairs or in groups. Again, I think students would enjoy this. It would give them practice of listening to the and the sound, as well as being able to practice pronouncing it and then listening to their partner. This class also works really well in correcting one another, and so I think working in pairs would work well with them because they can then correct their partner's pronunciation if it isn't clear enough. Thank you.